So, welcome everyone to the session on inflation expectations and consumption decisions. My name is Michael Weber from the University of Chicago. This is a session organized by the Asian Bureau of Economic and Finance Research, co-organized by Bernie Yeung from NUS, myself and Sumit Agarwal. We have a very nice set of 4 closely related papers helping us understand how agents form expectations not only about inflation, but also jointly about other variables, how these expectations transmit into individual consumption decisions, and ultimately also whether over the life cycle, maybe due to different consumption bundles over time, we might see actually changes in expectations over time. So without further delay, we are very happy to have Rupal Kamdar presenting the first paper. The presentations are 30 minutes, seminar style, and whenever you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A or, if possible, raise your hand. So, Rupal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Did that work? Oh, there we go. Okay, so hello everyone. First, thank you to the Asian Bureau of Finance and Economic Research, as well as our hosts, Bernie and Michael, for putting together this session. I'm very much looking forward to the papers that follow. So today I'll be presenting Polarized Expectations, which is a new project, which is joint work with Walker Ray. Broadly speaking, this project is about how political beliefs affect how individuals form their economic expectations, as well as how political beliefs affect the actions that people take. We think this is a particularly interesting question, especially along the backdrop of rising polarization in the US. Let me start with some stylized facts about polarization in the US context, which is the context we're going to be focusing on in this paper. At least to me, and I suspect to many of you, it definitely feels as though polarization has risen in recent years. And indeed, the data does support this. And while polarization has really come to the forefront of a lot of discussions following Trump's 2016 election, the overall trend in rising polarization is one that's much longer running. Take, for example, the Pew Research Center's estimates of how members of one party view the other party. In particular, note that from the mid-1990s to the mid-2010s, the rate at which Democrats found the Republican Party very unfavorable more than doubled, and similarly for Republican attitudes toward the Democratic Party. This polarization is also evident in the legislature in the US as well. The legislature has become more ideologically rigid and less cooperative. That's seen in these network charts that were made in a recent paper in the political science field that show how different members of Congress work together on enacting legislation. And you'll see that in 1979, for example, there was a lot of cooperation. However, fast forward to 2011, and you see barely any. This polarization has also seeped out of the political sphere and into households. Take, for example, estimates of the proportion of parents that would be displeased or unhappy if their children were to marry someone of the opposing party. In the 1960s, in the US, which is the top panel here, and our primary context, these rates were only 5%. However, in 2010, these rates are much higher. Democrats would be unhappy at a rate of 30%. However, Republicans, 50% of them would be unhappy. You can see a similar stylized fact, however, somewhat to a lesser extent in the UK in the bottom panel here. But again, we're focusing on the US. So of course, we are interested in what are the economic implications of polarization. And to this end, we ask 2 specific questions. First, do political beliefs affect people's economic perceptions and expectations, as well as the actions that people take? And 2, whether polarization has resulted in these impacts getting larger over time. And in the paper, we have a motivating theory and a model, as well as some empirics. However, for the sake of time today, I'm going to be extremely brief and just mention the theory here and dive further into detail on the empirical work that we do. So let me just give you a brief overview of our model. In it, we deviate from full information rational expectations. And in particular, we break the full information assumption. We allow the agents in our model to be rationally inattentive, a la Sims 2003, in that the agents themselves don't know the true state of the world, but they can acquire noisy signals about the state of the world. However, those signals are going to be costly. The agents in our model also have heterogeneous preferences. Ultimately, these heterogeneous preferences lead to belief dispersion due to optimal information gathering. Put another way, due to how the agents choose to learn, we can obtain ex post disagreement in beliefs. This leads us to an interesting theoretical contribution, which we call the paradox of information. It states that as information costs fall, the dispersion of beliefs can actually increase. The reason we like this result a lot is, well, during the time that polarization has increased, we've also seen that information has become more easy to obtain and seemingly pretty costless. In terms of the empirical results in our paper, and these are the ones I'm going to go through in further detail, let me give a quick overview here before diving in. So first, we test how political beliefs affect expectations. We use survey data to show that political preferences and economic beliefs are very tightly linked. That is, Republicans tend to have economic beliefs that are very consistent with other Republicans, and Democrats have beliefs that are very consistent with other Democrats. Then we show that beliefs are very persistent. They only switch when the political party in the White House switches. So for example, take the 2016 election of Trump. Prior to the election, Republicans were very optimistic about unemployment, business conditions, government policy, you name it. However, afterwards, they became very optimistic. Last but not least, the strength of this belief switching around presidential elections has increased over time, possibly a ramification of polarization. Beyond expectations, political beliefs also appear to affect actions, and the action we're going to look at today is consumption. We use voting data and consumption data from Nielsen around the 2016 election to conduct an event study. And we show that Republican areas have a differentially large increase in consumption following the 2016 election. This analysis we do at the zip code level. So we're excited to run a 2020 survey, which is still in the works as the 2020 election hasn't quite happened yet. But in this survey, we're planning to link an individual person's political preferences to their economic expectations and ultimately their consumption decisions. But we'll have to wait for those results. Okay. So let's dive into the empirical results in terms of expectations. The exact question we're going to ask is, do political shocks lead to differential or partisan impacts on consumer beliefs? To do this, we're going to use the Michigan Survey of Consumers, which is a long-running, rotating panel of consumers. It surveys households at most only twice and precisely 6 months apart. Sporadically, the Michigan survey does ask a question about the respondents' political party affiliation. Are you more Republican or more Democratic? However, this question is not particularly consistent and has only been started to be asked in recent years, but we'll use it. Ultimately, we're going to use this data to analyze beliefs as well as the changes in beliefs following elections. I began by plotting the aggregate consumer sentiment as published by the Michigan Survey of Consumers. Notice that around the 2016 election of Trump, there's a little bit of an increase in consumer sentiment in the aggregate. However, it's variation that's pretty typical for this series. However, this slight increase really hides interesting heterogeneity underneath the aggregate sentiment index. That is, people are both getting more pessimistic and another group of people is getting more optimistic. So let's see this, for example. using one specific question, in particular, the one about government policy. This question in the Michigan survey asks, thinking about government policy today, do you think it's good, fair, or bad? Using the panel structure of the Michigan survey, we can calculate the fraction of people who became more optimistic relative to the response 6 months ago, as well as the fraction that's become more pessimistic. And you'll see that following the election, there are spikes in both of these proportions. We can think about the probability of switching beliefs from optimistic to pessimistic in one other way. We can estimate the transition probabilities using a multinomial logic. So what we've plotted here is the probability that someone gives the optimistic response to the government policy question, that is, government policy is good, conditional on their response 6 months ago. So the green dots is conditional on being optimistic 6 months prior. In orange, we have conditional on the neutral response that government policy is fair. And finally, we have in blue squares, the conditioning on the pessimistic response to the question that government policy is bad. So we've plotted this from 2016 onwards. Let's first look at the period prior to Trump's election. During this period, the probability of remaining optimistic is incredibly high, whereas the probability of switching to pessimistic to optimistic is pretty much 0. In between, we have neutral, which is the probability of switching from neutral to optimistic, which is small, but there. This relative ranking stays the same until the 6 months that follow the election. During this time period, we see the probability of switching from pessimistic to optimistic jump up, so much so that it now surpasses the probability of remaining optimistic, which fell towards 0. After 6 months, we return to the before period's relative ranking of the probabilities. We could do the exact same thing with the probability that someone is pessimistic in a given period, conditional on their prior response. And again, the persistence of being pessimistic is extremely strong. The only time that that changes is the 6 months that follow the election. So one might be able to take an educated guess here and say, okay, the people who are switching from pessimistic to optimistic are Republicans, whereas the people switching in the other direction are Democrats. But remember I told you that we have some data on who is a Republican and who's a Democrat in the Michigan survey. So let's utilize that for a split second and just look at Democrats first and see the fraction of people that are responding to the government policy question in a pessimistic manner versus an optimistic manner. So to recall, from 2006 to 2008, we had a Republican president. And so Democrats were particularly pessimistic about government policy. Following that, Obama was the president, and we had relative optimism from Democrats. And then under Trump's era, we've turned back to being pessimistic. Notice that the switches happen primarily or only when there's an election that occurs that switches the White House's party. Similarly, you can see the opposite response for Republicans, where Republicans are extremely pessimistic about government policy under Obama at rates above 60%, whereas they've become more optimistic under Trump. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, political preferences are highly related to how one views government policy. So let's move towards more economic outcomes that may not be inherently linked to one's political preference. Let's think about business condition expectations. So this question asks, in the next 12 months, do you expect business conditions to improve, stay the same, or deteriorate? What we find again is that the probability of remaining with the type of response that you gave 6 months prior is extremely high, whereas the probability of switching is extremely low. The only time that these relative orders switch is the 6 months following the election. And again, we can plot this for the probability that someone is pessimistic as well. Again, the relative ordering and the stylized facts of this chart stay the same. Let's plot the fraction of Democrats that think business conditions are going to improve, which is the optimistic response, versus the fraction who think business conditions are going to deteriorate, the pessimistic response. Again, Democrats are pessimistic under Bush, optimistic under Obama, and pessimistic again under Trump. And vice versa for Republicans. This, the area where Republicans were under Bush is a little more noisy here. However, the optimism of business conditions really skyrocketed under Trump for Republicans. Last but not least, let's look at one more economic variable, namely unemployment. This question, the Michigan survey asks, in terms of the next 12 months, do you think unemployment is going to rise, stay roughly the same, or fall? And the optimistic response is obviously unemployment is going to fall. And we can think about the transition probabilities once again. The probability of remaining with your prior response stays incredibly high, whereas the probability of switching is low. Again, the only time this switches is the 6 months following the election. And you see the same thing for the probability pessimistic, conditional on your prior response. Looking at the fraction of Democrats who respond in a certain way to the unemployment question, we see that Democrats were extremely pessimistic under Bush, somewhat more optimistic under Obama, and then again, pessimistic under Trump, and vice versa for Republicans. Okay, so now that I've shown that political shocks do seem to affect economic beliefs and expectations, and there seems to be this switching behavior of beliefs around presidential elections where the White House switches parties, the next question we ask is, has this impact increased due to polarization over time? To get at this, as well as to, instead of just using one question at a time, I'm going to use a multiple correspondence analysis. In particular, an MCA. For those of you who don't know what an MCA is, it's pretty much a principal components analysis, which we typically use for continuous data, but an MCA is better suited to categorical data. So what I do is in this MCA, we throw in a bunch of questions from the Michigan Survey of Consumers, which are categorical questions, and we can extract the first component. I argue in previous work that the first component is a really good measure of someone's sentiment. One, it captures a lot of the variation in their consumer beliefs about various economic outcomes. And two, if you aggregate people's first component into an aggregate index, it looks really close to aggregate indexes of sentiment that we tend to use. So what do? We estimate this MCA and calculate the first component for each respondent. So this estimate is going to be an estimate of the person's sentiment. Then we regress someone's sentiment on their prior sentiment for each period in time. This plot from 2014 onwards shows that the persistence of sentiment is incredibly high, roughly 0.6, prior to Trump's election as well as after Trump's election. However, the 6 months that follow his election, you see a dramatic decline in persistence. In fact, the persistence turns slightly negative even. We can then extend this analysis using the entire sample of the Michigan Survey of Consumers. That is from 1980 onwards. First thing to notice, persistence tends to be pretty high on sentiment. The only handful of occasions where it noticeably drops is precisely when the White House switches parties. This is From Carter, who's a Democrat, to Reagan, you see a little drop. From Bush Sr. to Clinton, we see another drop in the persistence of sentiment. Again, Clinton to Bush Jr. To Obama, and lastly, Obama to Trump. You'll also notice that these drops in persistence of sentiment have been getting larger over time, suggesting that the switching in sentiment or the switching in economic beliefs is getting stronger over time as a ramification of polarization. Okay, I'm just gonna pause because I don't know if I can see someone raising their hand or something, so if anyone has a question, feel free to jump in here. Okay, so then we'll keep going. The next portion of our results are on how political beliefs affect consumption. That's the one action we're thinking about. And if there was a differential impact on consumption around the 2016 election. To do this analysis, we use two main data sources. First, the Nielsen home scanner data, which gives us an estimate of non-durable consumption at a high frequency. And then furthermore, we use 2016 voting data at the zip code level for 40 states in the US. Okay, so why do we do this at the zip code level? So some previous analyses that are related to ours have done analyses on the county level. Counties in the US are really quite big and can be very heterogeneous in that you can have very Republican areas and very Democratic areas within a county. So take, for example, Orange County in California. This county as a whole went 54% for Clinton. However, there were areas that voted very strongly for Trump. And so aggregating this all together results in some less clear results. You're adding noise. Therefore, we focus on the zip codes that are a little more homogeneous. We conduct an event study at the zip code level to assess how the Trump vote share affects consumption. In particular, we regress log consumption in zip code Z at time t on zip code fixed effects and weak fixed effects, as well as the Trump vote share in 2016 in zip code Z interacted with weak fixed effects. Ultimately, we're able to pull out an estimate for beta K, which can be interpreted as a 1 percentage point increase in a zip code's Trump vote share will result in a beta K % change in consumption K weeks after the election. So let's see the results. Week 0 is the week before the election. Notice that there is no pre-trend, there's no differential impact of how Republican an area is on the consumption prior to the election. Then the election happens, and we'll see that following the election, we have five positive coefficients here, 4 of which are significant. In terms of the magnitude of these, you can think about a 1 percentage point increase in the Trump vote share would result in a 0.1% increase in consumption. Put another way, if you were to go from a zip code with 0 Trump votes to 100% Trump votes, you would expect a 10% higher consumption in the 100% Trump county. Just to run a quick placebo test on the exact same weeks a year earlier in 2015, we don't find any substantial results there, nothing significant, pre or post the election date. And the last thing I want to just briefly talk about is what we're planning to do for the 2020 election. We're planning to add survey questions to the Nielsen Home Scanner panel, both before and after the election. We're going to ask questions about an individual's political affiliation, as well as who the individual thinks is going to win the next election, Furthermore, we're going to have economic forecasts, much like the questions that are asked in the Michigan Survey of Consumers. And last but not least, we'll have measures of consumption, as is always available with the Nielsen data, but we'll also have some questions that ask about durable consumption. The benefit of this is we're going to be able to do our analyses at the individual level and be able to link someone's political ideology to their economic beliefs and ultimately their consumption decisions. So we're particularly excited about doing that. So I'm gonna stop here because I'm a little worried that I'm not seeing hands raised or questions. So feel free to jump in here if there are any questions.
Okay, so in case there are no questions, thanks a lot, Rupal, for a very nice and exciting work also down the road with the upcoming election. And now we are very happy with Ricardo Nunes talking about inflation expectations, interest rate, and consumption.
Thank you so much. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you to Bernard and Michael for putting such a great session together. The papers are indeed very related, so we can all learn with each other's papers. I really look forward to your comments. So the paper is titled Inflation Expectation, Interest Rates, and Consumption Behavior. And this is joint work with Don Park, who is in the audience, and perhaps he can take the tough questions. If there are some tough questions, he can take them. Okay, so what is the motivation of the paper? The motivation partly is to understand consumption. Consumption is a central part of macro models. As you know, consumption is around 60 to 70% of GDP, so we really better get this part of the model right. Now, even in first year undergrad econ, you know that one of the biggest determinants of consumption is going to be the real interest rates, right? Now, because this really comes into intertemporal elasticity of substitution and how much you decide to save or consume today versus the future. However, the results from the empirical studies, surprisingly, are not entirely conclusive into this matter. And in the last decade, what all this audience has seen was a lot of papers about the response of private consumption to inflation expectations, right? So that really came to the forefront in modern macro because of the zero lower bound on nominal interest rates, right? So 20 years ago does really the real interest rate determine consumption? And in the last 10, 15 years, it became also, okay, if the nominal interest rate does not move, but then inflation expectation moves, and these will affect the real interest rate, what are the effects on consumption? Okay, so it's really the motivation. Let me already jump a little bit into what we do. We are going to consider a consumption function in the cross-sectional data. So here J denotes household J, and we also will have different observations over time. The paper unfortunately does not have a panel component, it's more of a repeated cross-section. And here we're just throwing what are some variables that determine consumption. So it's going to be the real interest rates, disposable income. Here, big R is just the gross rate of disposable income, and you can also think of some initial wealth or financial wealth. So one of the things that I'm gonna mention, and I think this is very clear, but not every paper has done that. Having said that, more and more papers start to do this, which is to also control for the effect of the nominal interest rate, even when you are just examining the effects of inflation expectations. So for instance, one of the papers that also does this is Dimitris and Michael's paper that comes after this, but actually you'll find several papers that have not incorporated this explicitly. So why is this important? I mean, it is important because in normal times, we have the Taylor principle. And so just think here the part of how monetary policy reacts to expected inflation. And if the Taylor principle is satisfied, that coefficient phi pi is bigger than 1. And just by very normal reasoning, higher inflation expectations leads to the nominal interest rate to respond more than 1 to 1. Therefore, the real rate would go up and consumption would go down. Now, what happens at the zero lower bound is exactly the opposite, which is the nominal interest rate does not react. Therefore, higher inflation expectations are coupled with a lower real rate, and therefore consumption would go up rather than go down. Okay, so this is why it is crucial really to condition on what are the expectations of private agents or households of what is the interest rate that they face and the interest rates that they will face in the future. Now, several papers, what they have done is that they focus on the zero lower bound period only. And that is fine, but I also need to sell a little bit my paper and a different way of doing this, which is if you just focus on the zero lower bound, you have an issue that samples can be short, even though as we speak, the samples are getting larger and larger, but still these samples can be short. And the other issue is inflation expectations of households. If households expect high inflation expectations, they could also expect an exit from the zero lower bound, okay? And this is not just a theoretical issue. For instance, in the Michigan survey, we do observe several households that have inflation expectations in the order of 5%, 10%, and sometimes even higher. So the question is, would those households also not expect, they should also be expecting an exit from the zero lower bound. So we avoid these of zero lower bound versus non-zero lower bound by observing directly the household's expectations on the nominal interest rate. So what we do, so we are going to test consumption theory using this micro level household data with this detailed decomposition of inflation expectation and nominal interest rates. I should clarify that these expectations are both quantitative, because let's say even in the Michigan survey, agents are asked whether they would expect nominal interest rates to go up or stay about the same. Or to go down, but here in this survey, we observe numerically what is the expectation of nominal interest rates. We are going to consider both durable and non-durable consumption, and that's going to be key, as you'll see, and we are going to link the empirical findings to a macro model. There are two other extra points that we do in the paper, but I don't think I'll have time to go over them in detail today. But so we also investigate the heterogeneity among households in the intertemporal substitution of consumption, so the reaction of consumption to real rates due to the differences in economic knowledge, whether they understand certain questions and whether they understand basic knowledge about how the economy works. We also tested discounting in the Euler equation following, let's say, work of Gabet that says inflation expectations down the road should have a smaller effect than inflation expectations that are in the short run. So we also do that in the paper, but in today's presentation, I'll speak less about those. Okay, let me tell you what are the main findings. So the main findings is that higher inflation expectations, they stimulate current durable consumption, but they decrease non-durable consumption. Now, you may find that this is a little bit awkward because there is one type of consumption that goes up and another type of consumption that goes down. So the first time we saw this, okay, maybe this data does not really make sense, but then we thought about it. And actually, this finding is consistent with the model, and that's something I'm also going to show you, what is happening is that durables are more sensitive to the real interest rates. And so when inflation expectations are high, durable consumption goes up, or actually reported durable consumption. So what agents would like to do in the future goes up. While non-durables, they are going to react less to this intertemporal elasticity of substitution effect, but then they are going to go down due to an eroding effect of inflation on nominal income. So one of the things that we are stressing is that inflation, you need to take into account the nominal income erosion that it creates, and also to compare with wage growth expectations that households have. Because if inflation is high and wage growth is not high, agents are going to put their consumption patterns down. In terms, we also find that economically informed households are more responsive in the intertemporal substitution for durable goods in terms of the real interest rates, and that the consumption Euler equation as discounting. But again, I don't think I'll have time to show you these last two findings. So the presentation is going to focus on these first two bullet points. Related literature. Of course, we are not the first to look into this literature. There are many papers. I think in terms of micro level household survey data, probably one of the first papers are very known is Bachmann, but a lot of work has followed, including by Michael Weber with co-authors that are cited here. But also to mention that these household survey data and inflation expectation consumption behavior, I don't want to mischaracterize the literature, but there is still a lot of disagreement. So we have studies that find that things could, that durables could go up, others find that could go down. So we still need to have more and more evidence and more data to determine what is going on. The paper also relates to durable goods and monetary policy, and this goes back to the papers of Barsky. And of course, it goes also into the discussion of consumption Euler equation and specification of forward guidance, that this starts with Egerton and Woodford. And the next paper that Dimitris will present, and is also co-authored with Michael, they will speak a lot about this. So the papers are all related. Okay, you are curious, so what is the data that we bring to the table? Because we are bringing another piece of evidence and another study. So what is this data? This data is micro-level household survey data from the Bank of England. This is called BOE-TNS Inflation Attitude Survey. It's a representative sample of around 2,000 households in UK. It's quarterly. But we will only use the February survey, so the Q1, because it has more respondents, but more importantly, there is a key question that we need, and it is only asked in the February survey. It is a repeated cross-section. It would be great if it is a panel, but unfortunately it is not. But it has so the questions about households' economic choices given their inflation expectations, so whether they are going to consume more durables and whether they consume more or less, and questions about inflation expectations, and also questions about the Bank of England bank rate expectations. I already told you what are the advantages of this data set, is that I can distinguish between inflation expectations and nominal interest rate expectations and at different horizons, and have the separate choices of durables and non-durables. Unfortunately, there is no panel component, but there is a large set of control variables that will be able to put into the regression, as expected wage growth, income, education, employment status, gender, age, region, and we are going to include time dummies to control for the aggregate variables. So any questions so far? Okay, no questions. Okay, this is the first picture in the paper, just to show you a validity of this micro data set. So it shows you what are the average household expectations 1 year ahead, and it compares it with the Bank of England forecasts 1 year ahead. So this is a graph that you can never win, because what we should see here is that they co-move, and so they co-move. But you should also see that there is some difference between what would be the Bank of England forecast and what is the average household expectations, because if they would be completely equal, then there is no point of asking households, okay? So this is a picture that you never win, because if these two lines are too different, then you say, okay, maybe the survey is not good. And if they are too equal, you say, okay, then I don't need the survey. So you see that here we are hopefully in a good middle ground, that they co-move, they are not too different, but at the same time, it is worthwhile that to gather the information at the micro level household data. The next picture is the same, but instead of being for inflation expectations, is for the bank rate expectations. And we have a similar picture in the sense that they co-move, but they are not too similar either, okay? Okay, let me jump into the first set of results. So in the column 1 is I do not put wage growth expectations, and this allows me to have more observations, but in the second column I include those. Usually the results are similar, but I need to restrict then the sample because not everyone answers that question. The question is phrased a little bit in a confusing way. So it's about cutback spending. So you can think about saving more. And I have here what you'd expect. So in red with the signs from a standard model. Okay, so if you have higher nominal expectations for the interest rate, you should save more. And this is also what you get in the survey. However, you should expect that higher inflation expectations, because they reduce the real rate, you should have here a negative coefficient. However, we observe that actually the coefficient is positive, okay, and is significantly positive. If we just bundle together and the nominal interest rate and inflation expectations, and we just speak about the real rate, then we see that it is negative, and this would be puzzling because you'd expect a positive, but you know from the previous graph that is coming from inflation expectations, not from the nominal interest rate. Then there is a separate question, which is about durables, okay? And here we see that inflation expectations have the expected sign, okay? And this is not about cutting back spending, it's about do you want to spend more money on durables, actually about bringing forward durable consumption, and we get a positive, we expect a positive sign, and is exactly what the survey is delivering. And is then what happens if we just put the real interest rate rather than distinguishing the two, and you get the expected sign from a model. Okay, so just summarizing, the higher inflation expectations, they increase the willingness to bring forward durable goods, and they increase the willingness to cut back spending. So now this sounds counterintuitive because you want to spend more on durables, but you want to spend less overall. But in fact, it's not contradictory with the theory. So if you look at this first point, which is the very standard Euler equation, higher inflation increases the ratio of current non-durable consumption to future durable consumption. But the key is that it is the ratio. It's not necessarily the level of the current non-durable consumption. So in fact, the level of current non-durable consumption can decrease because higher inflation could erode the values of nominal assets and or future nominal income. So this would say that the ratio of current to future goes up, but future goes up by so much that even the current goes down. And then if you look at the first order condition for durables and non-durables, you can see, and this is very known, that durables are more reactive to the real rate. So the ratio of durables to non-durables has to go up. So durables could still go up in level. These effects are usually missed when we just look at the consumption Euler equation as it is here, because you are not taking into account the budget constraint, okay? You're just taking account here, so this log linearized into the ratio of these two, but you need to take into account that future expected consumption could actually go down a lot. Let me just see how much time. Okay. Okay, so we then do a two-period model, and it's a very simple model just to get closed form solutions. So we have non-durable consumption and durable consumption, a standard utility function, and we have the budget constraint in period 1 and period 2 that is going to have a real component, let's say real income here, and nominal income here. So this is a very simple model. You just then solve it algebraically, and you can get the closed form solutions for consumption, non-durable consumption and durable consumption. Then you can do the derivatives, and so here in equation 10, of course, you see that nominal income is going to be eroded by inflation, and this would put consumption to be lower. So if you then do the derivatives, what is the derivative of consumption with respect to inflation? Well, so there is a part that goes through the real interest rate, and there is a part that goes through the erosion of nominal income. So if you just think in the usual ways that the nominal interest rate is going to reduce consumption, and if nominal income is zero, so the second term here would be zero, and this would say that the effects of inflation on consumption need to be positive. But once nominal income is positive, this is no longer necessarily the case because the second term can dominate, okay? Now, what I've shown you so far is that according to the theory, what we observed in the empirical evidence could happen, okay? That there is nothing necessarily contradictory. But what I've not shown you is it likely to happen, right? Because you can always build models that something weird happens. And so you may think, well, it can happen, but it's still a little bit weird that durables consumption goes up and then non-durables will go down. So this is what we do next, which is going to be a more complete model. So it's going to be an infinite horizon model. So it has a more complete utility function. So we are not going to solve these algebraically, then we simulate this model. So it has habits in consumption, habits in durables. The budget constraint as wage income, as the usual, also as a real component. And you have the laws of motion for durables, all that. Household expectations, so this is going to come as exogenous processes because we want to match what is in the survey, right? In the survey, we also observe that there is, let's say, one agent or one individual that is going to have higher inflation expectations than another. And what those regressions are telling you is, does such agent consume more or less? Okay, so this is also what we want to do in the model. What if someone has higher inflation expectations, and then we simulate and we compare with someone that would have lower inflation expectations? So in terms of calibration and the model, so we're trying to be very, very standard. So a lot of this comes from Smets and Wouters. As I've already hinted, a very important thing is going to be initial period nominal income. And we get that from the survey of consumer finances, and that's going to be around 70%. I'm going to show you a lot of robustness according to different numbers, okay? Okay, so what do you get when you simulate this model? So the impulse response function with respect to an inflation shock. We get exactly that durables go up. So they go up at the beginning, exactly because you are bringing forward durable consumption because it's a variable, it's durable. So you get the stock lasts for a while. Then of course, after some time you spend less and you're gonna settle in a lower level because there is nominal income erosion. Now look what happens at non-durables. Non-durables basically have a pattern that is always to be decreasing, and you're going to be settling at a lower level. So what we observe is consistent with what the survey is showing, is that durables, people try to buy more durables in the short term to get to use the favorable real interest rate, but then they are trying to reduce consumption overall, and that's very seeable in the non-durables because of the nominal income erosion. Let me skip this picture. Now, of course, something that is going to be key is the proportion of nominal income. And here we just do different benchmarks and we discuss in the paper why these benchmarks may also make sense. But you see, even if nominal income would just be 50%, you still get the same type of impulse response functions. Now you could ask, okay, but how would these square with the new Keynesian model, or let's say with Egerton-Woodford type of analysis? And well, if I put no nominal income, so everything is real, now we are in the green line where you'd expect that higher inflation expectations are clearly expansionary. Now the question is, what are the proportion of nominal income? And more importantly, what are the expectations of agents about their, for instance, wage growth? So we can also address this in the survey because we have wage growth expectations and inflation expectations. So you should just take this as a correlation. But you see here, so the numbers are very similar according to different specifications, and they're around 0.03. This number is really low, okay? So a perfect indexation of wages to inflation would give you a number of 1.0, while what you observe is 0.034. Now you could think, okay, but this shows that maybe the survey is terrible. And actually no, because in terms of macro data, this is what you would expect given the recent sample. So let me show you that for the, so let me show you that. Okay, so for the UK, if you run that equation, that regression on aggregate data, on the entire sample, you get a coefficient of 0.4. So 40% is protected you'd get a 40% increase relative to inflation, and still usually get a constant, right? That this may reflect productivity growth. There are just wage growth that is that grows over time because of productivity. But now focus on the recent samples. So after 2007 or 2011, the correlation between CPI inflation and wage inflation is much lower. And it's just not a phenomenon for the UK. You also observe this for the US, okay? For the entire sample, these numbers are large, or more in line what you'd expect. But in the more recent samples, they would be, again, very low. And this is what we are seeing as well, so in the survey. So these numbers make sense vis-a-vis the aggregate data, and this survey only starts. So we only use data from 2011 onwards. So what happens if I put wage expectations set to 0.034, which is what the survey is telling you? Well, the picture doesn't change at all. So let me just, this was when wage growth expectations are 0. 0.034 is still a very low number. Now, of course, if you would have nearly perfect indexation of wages to inflation, the picture would be very different, okay? That's what comes next. So here, if I put wage expectations set to 0.95, sure, then things would be very different. So what this paper also cautions is that the effect of higher inflation expectations could be very different for different countries, for different time periods, exactly because the wage expectations could be very different for those different countries or for those different periods. And that what our model can capture is that for the Bank of England survey time sample with wage expectations being very low and not following higher inflation expectations, what is in that survey makes perfect sense, that durables would go up, but people would still try to cut back spending overall. So I have a bunch, we did a bunch of robustness checks. Honestly, I lost a little bit track of time, if I have time or I'm running late. And if Michael—
You have 4 more minutes, Ricardo.
4, you said?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just tell you briefly what we did. So, of course, something that is very debated is elasticity of intertemporal substitution. We did, according to what are the results in Smets and Walters, you know, things don't change that much. We also did exogenous labor, because when you estimate a macro model, of course, you have variation in hours, but can come between extensive, intensive margin. While you could think, and we could also condition on the survey about people that expect to work the same amount of hours. So even if we run the model for exogenous labor, things are very similar. Of course, there is a debate on the elasticity of substitution between durables and non-durables. That is also a key parameter. Things don't change much for the benchmark or for other values of this elasticity of substitution mentioned in the literature. Something that the durables literature emphasizes are financial frictions, because sometimes durables are expensive, so you may need to get credit. And not everyone has that credit. So we also put what if you have adjustment costs in the budget constraint, or even hand to mouse, okay? And even with hand to mouse, of course, the durables are not gonna go up as much, but they go up a little bit. And so you still observe something very similar to what the model is saying. Then other things that actually matter even less: steady state inflation, trend growth, and the type of habit formation. Let me not go into the cross-sectional heterogeneity. We do find it that informed households have a significant, statistically significant, and they react by more than non-informed. But we only find that for the durable consumption, not for the cutback spending. Having said that, this is what makes sense, because with cutting back spending, an informed household that is, let's say, smarter than other households, he will understand two effects, and those two effects go against each other. To one extent, he would understand that lower real rates would make him to save more, but then he would also, to save less, sorry, but then he would also understand that the nominal income erosion in the future would make him to save more. So it's not clear that if you are smart, what you would do with that information. While in terms of durable consumption, it is clearer. And that is it. So the conclusions, I don't think I need to go over it because just 30-minute presentation, you have it in your mind. But so here, what we find is that the standard consumption saving model works, but we need to have a cautious message on the effects of increasing inflation expectations. Because yeah, it would increase durable consumption, it would decrease the other. But also you have to, a central bank in terms of its policy would need to be very cautious about if it says, well, now inflation will be higher, so agents should have higher inflation expectations. The central bank would need to think, what are wage growth expectations, okay? Because if agents also expect wage growth to go up together with inflation, the effects would be very different if agents expect nominal wage growth to be zero. This may be particularly challenging in a recession, right? That is usually when you hit the zero lower bound. The central bank would say, okay, higher inflation expectations, and if unemployment is high, it may be hard to convince people that their wage growth would go up as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Ricardo. Very interesting and insightful results, especially also given the backdrop of the strategy review of the Federal Reserve. And now we have Dimitris Georgarakos from the European Central Bank telling us about forward guidance and household expectations.
Okay, can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. The paper title is Forward Guidance, Household Expectations. This is joint work with Coibion, Yuriy Gorodnichenko, and Michael Weber. So I'm in the fortunate position to have Michael here. So in case you would like to ask some questions via chat, I'm sure Michael stands ready to answer them. So I think this paper nicely fits to the program, especially to what just Ricardo presented. So there is widely recognized the key role of forward guidance in stimulating economic activity, especially since the onset of ZLB. There is a growing interest in policies that move, especially consumers and firms' inflation expectations when you're at the ZLB, according to the standard mechanism. If a policymaker moves upwards inflation expectations by consumers, anticipates that also this will incentivize spending on behalf of households and investing on behalf of firms. Of course, as Ricardo just showed, and there are some other recent related papers, there is also some possibly counterintuitive effects estimated in the data. But in any case, the importance of stimulating economic activity via expectations, both for firms and households, has been recently, as I said, widely recognized. And of course, this is supported by new data and new surveys that survey both households and firms. So here we cite three recent related references from prominent policymakers, both sides of the Atlantic. So Janet Yellen has stressed that the strategy of forward guidance also potentially supports aggregate demand by raising inflation expectations, thereby lowering real long-term rates relative to a Taylor type baseline, and similar statements highlighting in particular the role of perceptions that economic agents develop by Christine Lagarde and Ben Bernanke. So in this paper, we focus in particular on forward guidance and households. It is known that empirically, when you look at aggregate data, especially data from financial markets, the effects of forward guidance that one is able to identify are relatively modest compared to what standard models predict. And by focusing on households, we focus on the activity of one of the key economic actors, and so this a different view from focusing, say, on the direct financial market channel, as most papers do. And there is relatively limited evidence on how house expectations respond to forward guidance announcements, in particular about evolution of future policy rates, despite the fact that this represents a key mechanism in standard Keynesian models. So let me first start with a preview of what we are doing. We use a large-scale US survey of over than 25,000 US consumers, for which I will give you some information later. And we run a randomized control trial. So as I will explain, we basically split randomly the sample into different subsamples and provide these subsamples with different pieces of information. And we see their adjustments in expectation behavior before and after the provision of this information in relation to a control group that doesn't receive any information. So this allows us to make some causal inference and see whether these information treatments about interest rates and inflation affect indeed households' different expectations, but also whether they affect them jointly. Given the large scale of the survey, as you will see, we use a very large number of treatments, so we are able to split randomly the sample into a number of segments. But in order to give you an overview, these treatments differ across three key dimensions. The first is the information variable that we provide the info about. So this regards for some households policy rates, for some others is inflation, and for some others is mortgage market rates. The second key dimension across which our treatments differ is horizon. So to some households we communicate about current rates, to some others about past, and to some others about future periods by varying the horizon from next to 3 years and the longer term. As well as you will see, we use different predictions of path of future rates. So we use central tendency, upper and lower ranges, again to see to what extent different households respond to this type of information. And by setting this RCT, then we estimate the causal effects of this information treatments on 5 different outcomes. The first is mortgage expectations about mortgage rates, nominal mortgage rates. The second is about expectations about real mortgage rates. The third is expectations about inflation. The fourth, expectations about unemployment. And we also relate to planned spending decisions. So This is a summary of our main findings. First of all, we observed that there is limited household pre-treatment knowledge about prevailing interest rates in the economy. This perhaps not surprising especially if you look at household studies that in general find that people tend to be uninformed or inattentive. But I think this is the first time that there is direct evidence on this. We also find that communications beyond 1 year into the future only have a very small influence on expectations. And this empirical finding supports models with agents with limited capacity to collect and process information like those developed in these 3 recent papers we cite here. We also find that communication about current and next period policy rates move expectations as much as communicate about current inflation and mortgage rates. So on the one hand, it looks like that there are some kind of more transient effects of the inflation treatments on our outcomes. And by the way, note that the survey is a panel, so we can trace people also 1 and 3 months after the provision of information. While on the other hand, communicating about current mortgage rates seems to have more persistent effects on moving households' beliefs and expectations. We also find that households tend to revise their inflation expectations along with their interest rate expectations. Nevertheless, not in a one-for-one fashion. As a result, there is a dampening effect there that is worth investigating empirically. We don't find any effects on these information treatments on house expectations about aggregate unemployment, while we find some effects on their spending plans. So what is this randomized controlled trial approach? So basically, we take the entire sample and we ask all households a set of questions regarding their expectations and plan decisions. And then we randomly split the sample into different groups. And take one of these groups, it is provided with a specific information treatment. So for example, information about prevailing mortgage rates, or as you will see, information about forecast about the federal funds rates next year and over different horizons. Then we ask, after the provision of this information, again about expectations of these people. We ask basically similar questions to those we asked pre-treatment, though not exactly the same, because asking in the same survey 2 times the same question tends to annoy respondents. So we modify them a bit. But still, we can trace moves in their expectations and posterior beliefs following the information treatment. And also we can measure their exposed decisions. As I said, the survey is a panel, so we can track them and see whether this provision of information has persistent effects on the revisions they make on their expectations and beliefs and decisions, always in relation to a control group that doesn't receive any such information. So any changes we see in behavior of the treatment group relative to control group should be due to this information treatment. Of course, this randomization has certain advantages. Results are not driven by observed or unobserved characteristics. So unobserved heterogeneity, that's typically an issue in this kind of studies, is not an issue here under an RCT approach. So the data we use come from 3 waves from the Chicago Booth Expectation Communications survey. This is the Nielsen Consumer Panel. Michael has used the survey in a number of projects. This is a fascinating data set. And one of its key features is that it has a very large sample size. So over almost 27,000 consumers. This allows for splitting into several samples and as I said, randomly, and then providing different subsamples with different information treatments. First, we fielded, the first wave had 34 questions, almost 20 minutes, and also there are survey weights that we use to make our sample representative to the entire US population. And in addition, you can find in the paper some validation tests we perform against other micro surveys that were on the field at the time. We first conducted this March 2019. And the results are indeed quite comparable as regards basic expectation demographics. So this is to cross-validate our data. So as I said, we first wave in March 2019 collected some background information on households, including the current demographics, recent spending, and other information, as well as expectations and perceptions. In particular, we asked households about their expectation perceptions as regards mortgage rates. This is a borrowing vehicle that basically we refer to a fixed rate 30-year mortgage. That's a borrowing vehicle in the US that is very popular. So most of the mortgages, over 70%, are of this type. So people are supposed to know details for these mortgages. And we ask them the question you see at the bottom: what do you think is the current interest rate of a fixed rate 30-year mortgage for someone like you, and what do you think will be in the future? So they report their current perception, but also expectations over different horizons. And we ask also similar questions about inflation expectation, unemployment expectations. Here you see the question about inflation expectation that here is designed. Its design follows the one by the counterpart question asked in the NY Fed survey, with probabilistic beans first asking about to allocate points across deflation and inflation bands. This allows, in principle, to measure also inflation uncertainty. And this is the question about perceptions of current unemployment rate, aggregate, and 1 year ahead. And then, as I said, we provide to different random subsets of the sample various information treatments that I'll give you more details in a second, and collect expectations again. And then we'll have follow-up wave 3 months later, and again in September 2019. So this is how raw data look like in the pre-treatment observations. So you see dispersion of nominal mortgage rate expectation perceptions, and this is quite common to have dispersion in household surveys. And you see the current rate. So this implies that people have hold to quite diverse views before we provide them with any treatment information. And likewise for inflation and expected unemployment rate. Here is again some correlations of raw data pre-treatment. So correlation between inflation expectation and mortgage rate on the left panel, and on the right one with unemployment rate expectations. You see, broadly speaking, there is this kind of positive association. Nevertheless, if you see in more detail, you zoom in, you will see significant heterogeneity in the reported, in the association between the reported respective expectations. So this calls for more systematic empirical analysis. So let me go now over the different treatments. Basically, we have 23 treatment groups, while the 24th group of the evenly split sample serves as the control group. So one of these 23 groups receives just placebo information about population growth, to see if there is a kind of numeric anchoring for the number we provide. And we find there are very little effects compared to the baseline control group. Now, beyond this, we have a number of other treatment groups. So let me summarize them. So we provide some households with information about current federal funds rates, current and past, and current and future over different horizons. I think it would be easier to summarize by showing you these pictures where you see basically predicted paths of federal funds rates, high, low, and central tendency over different horizons. So one treatment group receives this piece of info that you see at the bottom of the slide, and I'm going to read it. So we tell them that the interest rate set by the Federal Reserve, known as the federal funds rate, is currently at 2.5%. One forecast from the Federal Reserve is that this interest rate will be 3.1 on average in 2019, 3.6 in 2020 and 2021, and 3.5% in the longer run. So you see, we provide the numbers without revealing to this treatment group that this is indeed the kind of high path forecast. We show you one forecast. And likewise for the low, without revealing that this is the low, just we show the numbers over the different horizons. For the medium, for the short term, for again short term high, short term low, medium term combinations of different paths. So all sorts of combinations, as you see. And in addition, we have one treatment group that we not only provide information about future paths of interest rate, but also information about past rates. And as we're going to see, this is particularly effective. Another group is provided only with information about past rates. So we have all these treatment groups providing information about policy rates, and on the top we have treatment group that is provided with information about mortgage rates, as I said, with reference to a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, so its current rate, as well as a number of treatment groups provided with information about inflation rates, again in a similar fashion as we did about nominal interest rates. So to some households we communicate about only last year's inflation, or we provide an average, we combine with forecasts, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to make out of this RCT, how we're going to analyze the data. So basically, we're going to estimate a series of regressions for each treatment group, where we're going to regress on the left-hand side expectations, and these are expectations about inflation, expectations about mortgage interest rates, unemployment, on a dummy denote on their pre-treatment expectations, and then a dummy on the treatment, plus an interaction term of the treatment interacted with the prior expectation. So this basically estimate on the treatment dummy gives the level effect, that is a signal relative to the initial belief, while the gamma K parameter that we're going to estimate is obviously under some Bayesian updating. Respondents attach some weight to their prior beliefs and to their posterior after receiving the treatment. The stronger the signal of the treatment, the more negative this gamma K is going to be. The stronger the signal of the treatment, this means that they will put proportionally higher weight to the treatment relative to their prior. And instead of showing you tons of numbers, I think it will be more effective to show you this in a graph where we associate the prior and the posterior. These are scatter plots of the raw data where we fit also, we have a fitted line. And here is the line relating expectations about nominal mortgage rates 1 year ahead, so end of 2019, relating posterior and the prior for the control group. The control group, recall, doesn't receive any kind of information, so it should display by construction similar expectations before and after treatment on here on the mortgage rate expectation. And indeed is the case. You see the line is close to the 45-degree line. Note that small deviations in pre and post treatment expectations of the control group will be only due to basically some difference in wording we use before and post treatment in our questions, as I said, to avoid annoying respondents. Here is the line that you get when you look at one of our treatment groups that basically receives information about current mortgage rates. So basically we see that this rotates a lot downward, so this implies that respondents put quite a high weight on the information they received about prevailing mortgage rates. And then you see the treatments they receive with reference to different predictions of funds rates with different horizons. And what you see that when you go beyond 1 year horizon, so you give additional information about second year, third year forecast or the longer term, this doesn't have extra effects on how people update their expectations. When we look at people's expectations over longer horizons, we see that the effects of various treatments shrink. Here we see that basically if you look at different treatments, information about current inflation rate tends to be as effective as information about current nominal rates. Here you don't see it exactly in the graph because this is close to the 45 degrees line, but there is some heterogeneity in various inflation treatments we have here. So if you see the current inflation, the line alone is much more, has a higher negative slope. So it's comparable more to the blue and to the blue line. So here is how our information treatments affect revisions in expected inflation. And we see that information about policy rates tends to be quite influential for inflation expectations. Of course, also informing people about current inflation tends to be powerful, even more so. You see the green line is more negative than the blue and red ones. And likewise, we see over different horizons, and we see again that there is only little value added providing info about policy rates more than 2 years out. Note that we have micro data. We know nominal mortgage rates expectations. We have also inflation expectations for each person. By taking the difference, we can have an individual specific real mortgage rate expectations. And we can see also for this how they are affected by the various treatments. So we find that treatments tend to dampen the variation in post-treatment beliefs about real interest rates relative to the corresponding pre-treatment variation, and that providing information about future policy rates beyond the 1 year horizon leads to no material difference, again, as we found for previous expectations. Also, we find that when households revise their nominal expectation rates downwards, they also tend to revise their inflation expectation downwards, however, by less, and vice versa. So the real interest rate expectations are less sensitive by these counteractive moves, they become less sensitive to news. And we find no effects of forward guidance or inflation treatments on household expectations about aggregate unemployment. As you see, everything lies almost perfectly on the 45 degrees line. We find some short-lived effects of inflation on inflation and unemployment expectations. This is in line with some related previous work, but longer-lived effects on nominal real mortgage rate expectations. So it might be the case that policy announcements that target different variables have different effectiveness. Communicating, for example, about interest rates is likely to have kind of more persistent effects on households than communicating about inflation. And the last thing we're doing is we have information on people's readiness to spend. They say it's a good time to purchase a durable good at the time of the survey, and we see to what extent this is affected by our treatments. So we estimate a model where on the right-hand side, the key variable of interest is post-treatment real interest rate expectations that of course are endogenous, but we can use our instruments and the RCT setup to instrument for this endogenous variable.
Dimitris, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, sure. I'm about to finish. So basically we find that when you exogenously rise real interest rate expectations of households, by using different types of treatments, this tends to decrease the likelihood of saying that's a good time to buy a durable good. This is consistent with the standard mechanism we have in mind. So let me conclude. We use a large-scale RCT where we are able to compare the causal effects of forward guidance on household expectations. One of our key findings is that communicating to households about paths of nominal interest rates beyond 1 year into the future has only very small additional effects on expectations. And this is consistent with individual cognitive limitations. Some recent models have emphasized this and contrast the usual notion we have about how financial markets work. Communications about current and next period policy rates are as effective as communicating about current inflation or mortgage rates. And also we find that households tend to revise their views about nominal interest rates and inflation in the same direction. It's important to keep this in mind when communicating different variables to households, as this is likely to dampen the response of real interest rates to new information. This is my last slide. So what results from our study can imply for a kind of optimal forward guidance design? On the one hand, as regards the optimal horizon, it looks like communicating about shortened horizons could be more effective in moving household expectations, as this piece of info seems to convey information about the current level of variables, and indeed households appear to have to be very uninformed about. So this is sufficient to move their expectations significantly. And on the other hand, as regards future instruments or targets, this debate, our study suggests that the persistence of treatment effects on expectations differ significantly. There are some, as I said, more transient effects for inflation treatments, but on the other hand, some more persistent for mortgage rates. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dimitris. And we are very happy to move to the last paper of the session on inflation expectations and the upgrading channel. And you from NUS will present. Thank you.
Right. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Chua from the National University of Singapore. So this is a joint work with Sumit Agarwal, also from NUS, and Chang Song from Singapore Management University. So first of all, we would like to thank the organizers for including our paper in this conference. We are very excited to be here and to be able to share with us and share with you our findings. So in this particular paper, we're going to explore something called the inflation expectations of households and the upgrading channel. So allow me to begin by motivating this paper. So in recent years, there's been much interest in the study of households' inflation expectations. So from Janet Yellen to Ben Bernanke, there has been suggestions to make use of inflation expectations in order to stimulate growth. And this especially relevant in a low interest rate environment. However, there's been no consensus with regard to the drivers of households' inflation expectations. Recent studies have identified several factors that could influence households' inflation expectations. This includes the price and perceptions of inflation, shopping experience, media, as well as the understanding of economic policies. So at the start of today's session, Rupal have shared with us the role of political polarization. Dimitris talked about forward guidance communication. All these have an important role to shape inflation expectations. On the other hand, Ricardo talked about the impact of inflation expectations on private consumption. So for us, we're going to build on the literature in relation to the personal experience of households. So in particular, we're going to study how changes in the consumption bundle of goods could impact inflation expectations. We call this the upgrading channel. So what is it about? So while much work has been done documenting the effect of quality change on households' actual inflation rate, there's actually little evidence studying impact of quality change. So what we're going to do right now is to combine administrative data and a survey experiment to evaluate how lifestyle changes will play a role in influencing households' inflation expectations in Singapore. Now, lifestyle changes, together with economic development for the past decades, have contributed to the changing basket of goods for consumers. Moreover, items that are not previously available, like smartphones, are now considered to be daily necessities. So as the standard of living increases for the median household, inflation expectations could increase as well. So we call this upgrading channel because for the same product category, households could shift their spending towards brands of higher quality. In doing so, they're going to exhibit something called higher inflation expectations. So do allow me to give you a simple intuition. Suppose a household's inflation expectations is a weighted average of two types of goods, high quality and low quality. And this occurs across two time periods, period 0 and period 1. The price of a high quality good in period 0 and period 1 is P high 0 and P high 1. The price of a low quality good in period 0 and period 1 is P low 0 and P low 1. Now W0, W1 will refer to the weight of the high quality good in period 0 and period 1. Okay. So effectively, an increase in these inflation expectations can be due to two things. Number one, an increase in price of the goods from P0, P1, or an increase in the weights from W0, W1. We're going to define upgrading as an increase in the weights towards better quality goods, i.e., we increase our W1 from W0. So this is what we mean by the upgrading channel. So let me present a roadmap ahead. In essence, I hope to share with you two things. Number one, I want to establish that there's upgrading in Singapore. So right behind me, you can see Singapore's skyline. So to show that Singaporeans and households in Singapore are upgrading across different categories of goods, we examine the transaction level credit card data from a leading bank in Singapore. Next, to show that households are upgrading within a specific category of goods, we're going to exploit the Nielsen home scan panel. I'll elaborate a bit more on the data in the next few slides. Number two, I would like to establish that there is a relationship between upgrading and inflation expectations. To do so, I'm going to make use of a survey experiment that we conducted and to link our survey experiment with the Nielsen home scan panel. So let's have a quick look now at how Singaporeans are upgrading across different categories of goods. Here, we use a unique panel data set obtained from Leading Bank in Singapore. The bank has more than 4 million customers in Singapore, which is about approximately 80% of Singapore's population. So our data sample contains a random representative sample of more than 180,000 unique individuals during two time periods, 2011 and 2016. For each individual in our sample, we do have transaction level data about the credit card spending involving the date, amount spent, as well as merchant name and goods category. We subsequently divide them into 5 different quintiles and find the change in the spending across categories. So this is what we do for the credit card data. And you can have a quick look and realize that across the different categories of goods, we observe that the increase in credit card spending differs across quintiles. So for luxury goods such as watches and jewelry, the increase in spending is larger in the second quintile, followed by the third quintile. In comparison, for entertainment, the increase in spending is larger in the first quintile, followed by the second quintile. So this suggests that for households in the lower quintiles, there is an increase in their spending towards more luxury products like watches and jewelry, as well as entertainment. So for households in high quintiles, they spend more in clothing and restaurants. So we can see that households in different quintiles do change their consumption basket of goods. So we now zoom in now to a specific category of goods, groceries. To study consumers' choice of grocery goods in detail, we use the transaction level data of 900 households between 2016 to 2017. So as used before in a previous presentation just now, okay, so the Nielsen Home Scan panel in Singapore is similar and has large coverage and is demographically and geographically representative of Singaporean households. Essentially, it tracks household purchases of all grocery goods from all the retail outlets in Singapore. Using a barcode scanning device, households in the panel electronically record their purchases. So we also have their demographics. We have things such as their race, household size, income, age, and postal code. So let's have a quick look now at the summary stats. As mentioned, there are around 900 households. On average, they spend around $122. The majority of them do have a household size of between 1 to 4. And the household income looks pretty well distributed. So, and they're all senior, majority of them are seniors, and we do have 80% Chinese and 80% staying in public housing. So that's fairly representative of Singapore's population. So from this data, we are able to create a monthly upgrading index for each household. So for each category of goods, we are able to group the brands into 10 different bins based on the price per weight. Here, 1 refers to the lowest price per weight, while 10 refers to the most expensive good. So this is an indication of the quality of a good and has been used in the literature. Once with the quality indicator for each good, we are able now to compute each household's quality of goods index. Here, QIT refers to household I's quality index at time period T. XJT refers to quality of good J consumed by household I at time period T. And we then sum it across n number of goods. So the household's quality index should lie between 1 to 10. If a household purchases all the goods in the lowest bins for all categories, they will obtain an index of 1. Conversely, if the household purchases all the goods in the highest bins for all the categories, they will obtain an index of 10. We shall now present changes in the household's index of quality during the 24 months. So the graph in the top left-hand corner presents the overall change in the quality index for all the households. We find that over time, there's an increase in the index as households switch to better quality goods. And this increase in quality index is consistent across all housing types as well as housing incomes. So it's consistent throughout all cases. Now, we turn to our survey. So we conducted a personal interview survey with surveyors conducting face-to-face interviews across Singapore. It was pre-COVID, of course. So the survey was filled between March to July 2019 and was conducted at different places, such as outside shopping malls, food courts, and train stations. So each survey takes around 15 minutes to complete, and each respondent is given 20 Singapore dollars as a form of compensation. So it's around 15 US dollar. So 1 minute, $1, that's not too bad. Now, so in our survey, there are 3 sections. Firstly, we obtain information of their demographics and individual economic circumstances. This includes the information of their age, gender, race, housing type, and financial literacy. The second section builds on a New York Fed survey of consumer expectations. We collected a range of household expectations of the economy, including the inflation expectations. And finally, we conducted our survey experiment. Now, so our survey experiment follows several studies in literature, and it is similar to what Dimitris has mentioned earlier. So I will not go into detail. Okay, Dimitris has done a great job in explaining this RCT for survey experiment. Essentially, we first elicit the subject's inflation expectation at the start of the survey. The subject will give a specific number which constitute their prior belief. We then provide the subject with information that's related to different treatment groups. Finally, we ask them about their inflation expectations again. So for this survey, we randomly assign households to 3 treatment arms. So unlike Dimitris, we don't have 24 treatment arms to solve this. All right, so what are our 3 treatment arms right now? So we introduce something that most Singaporeans can relate to, eating ice cream. In particular, the brands Walls and Haagen-Dazs. While Walls cater to the mass market, Haagen-Dazs seeks to position itself as a super premium brand. So since Walls and Haagen-Dazs can be considered to be a normal good and luxury good respectively, we want to see how the subjects update their inflation expectations, given information about the different types of goods. In 2009, 1.5 litre of ice cream for Walls cost 5 Singapore dollars, but 1 pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream cost $12. In 2019, both ice creams increased by approximately 20% to $6 and $14.45. So our experimental design seeks to focus on how respondents react to price changes of different types of goods. As you can see in the first row, we provide the price of Walls in 2009 for the entire 3 treatment groups. Sorry. Subsequently, we then vary the price information in 2019 by showing them prices of different goods. For T1, households were given Walls. For T2, households were given Haagen-Dazs. For T3, both Walls and Haagen-Dazs were given. So by varying the availability of the price information in 2019, our objective is to study how households respond to prices of different goods. So this is our 3 treatment arms, and we're going to look at our summary stats now. So in all, we have 1036 respondents across all 3 treatment groups, and demographics are a good representation of Singapore's population. I will not go through the summary stats in detail, but allow me to highlight 2 different things. Number 1, it is evident from the p-value that our random assignment of subjects does create balanced treatment in control groups, except for one indicator, negative outlook. Nonetheless, the fact that 1 out of 15 variables is significant at 10% level is expected under random assignment. Secondly, we find that households in Singapore have significantly higher inflation expectations as compared to the actual inflation rate. Among the so-called pre-treatment inflation expectations, they are between 6.6% to 8.17%. In comparison, Singapore's actual inflation rate was 0.6% in 2019. Now, there could be so many reasons for this divergence, but one possible reason could be due to the upgrading channel. So we're going to turn to our survey experiment now for further investigation. We present the pre-treatment and post-treatment inflation expectations of all the treatment groups alongside the 90% confidence interval. So it's evident that provision of information has different effects on the inflation expectations of subjects in different treatment groups. For T1, there's a fall in inflation expectations relative to pre-treatment levels. In comparison, there's an increase in inflation expectations for T2. Finally, the fall in inflation expectations in T3 is smaller vis-a-vis that of T1. So more formally, we are going to estimate the treatment effects through the following regression. Here, delta pi I relates to the change in inflation expectations of individual I due to the treatment. T2 is an indicator for treatment 2. T3 is an indicator for treatment 3. Xi now are the controls we talked about earlier in summary stats. They include things like gender and age. Eta D is the district level fixed effects. Eta E is an enumerator fixed effect. Eta M is a survey month fixed effects. So let's take a quick look at the results now. So in column 1, we included controls, but not fixed effects. In column 2, we included both controls and fixed effects. Both columns indicated that the treatment effects on inflation expectations are significant. From column 2, we can see that subjects in T2 reported an increase in inflation expectations of 505 basis points as compared to T1. This suggests that solely providing price information on the higher quality goods in 2019 and not the lower quality product will result in higher inflation expectations. In comparison, subjects in T3 reported an increase in inflation expectations of 162 basis points. Therefore, providing additional information of the higher quality good in 2019 together with the lower quality product will also lead to an increase in inflation expectations. In addition, from our work test, we do find that the change in inflation expectations in T2 and T3 are significantly different. Now, the difference between T2 and T3 shows that inflation expectations increase less when the information of higher and lower quality products are made available. In order to quantify the extent to which inflation expectations are affected by higher quality products, we're going to compute something called an upgrading alpha. So the upgrading alpha here relates to the ratio of a difference between the change in expectations of T3 and T1 and the difference between the change in expectations of T2 and T1. So intuitively, the upgrading alpha will measure the weight that respondents place on the additional price information on a luxury good informing inflation expectations. The larger the value of the upgrading alpha, the more emphasis is going to be placed on a luxury product. In our case, Haagen-Dazs. So we note that the upgrading alpha should lie between 0 and 1. When the upgrading alpha is equal to 0, this suggests that there's no difference between T3 and T1. That is, the respondents in T3 ignore the additional information of Haagen-Dazs. When the upgrading alpha is equal to 1, it suggests that there's no difference between T3 and T2. What does this mean? This suggests that respondents in T3 only focus on the additional information of Haagen-Dazs in 2019 and not Walls in 2019. So based on our results, we estimated the upgrading alpha to be 0.32. Therefore, in the formation of their inflation expectations, households do allocate around 32% of weight on the price of Haagen-Dazs in 2019. Now, to examine households' differential response to different treatments, we are going to analyze the heterogeneous treatment effects through the following ORS regression. So everything is the same as we talked about earlier, except for ZI. So ZI is an indicator for frequent shoppers, which occurs when the respondents shop at least once per week. For frequent shoppers, the upgrading alpha is estimated to be 0.56. For non-frequent shoppers, the upgrading alpha is estimated to be 0.12. This means that in forming their inflation expectations, the weightage on the price information of the higher quality product plays a larger role for frequent shoppers as compared to non-frequent shoppers. Finally, we're going to study the upgrading channel by mapping our survey with a personal shopping experience from Nielsen's home scan panel. Here, we're going to examine the relationship between changes in the household quality index and household inflation expectations at the group level. We cannot map out survey subjects and Nielsen subjects at the individual level because they are different. So, but what we can do is we can link them at a group level. So households are being categorized in the same group if they share the same characteristics. Household income, postal code, household size, race, and frequency of shopping. That's all we have. So based on the assumption that households in the Nielsen home scan panel and our survey is representative to the households in each group, we can map around 195 groups that are common in both samples. We then run the following regression. Here, pi j refers to the average inflation expectations in each group j. Uj refers to an upgrading index, which we define as the difference between the average household quality index for the last 3 months and first 3 months. We do so to prevent outliers in a particular month from driving our results. The covariates gamma j right now refers to the demographics and personal characteristics that we used to map them earlier. So what do we see? We see that an increase in the upgrading index by 1 unit will suggest that the household have purchased brands of better quality goods by 1 bin for the entire bundle of goods. So this is how we interpret this particular results. And this is our results now. Column 1. Column 1 shows the results without any controls and fixed effects, while column 2 reports the results with both controls and fixed effects. In both cases, they show a positive relationship. We find that an increase in the upgrading index by 1 unit corresponds to an increase in inflation expectations by 65 basis points in column 1 and 52 basis points in column 2. This suggests that households that upgraded to better quality products indeed reported higher inflation expectations. So this do provide evidence for our upgrading check. Now for discussion, one of the common issues of survey experiments is attributed to spurious learning. So instead of inducing genuine learning, the information provision could result in respondents reporting numbers for spurious reasons. So we're going to provide 2 pieces of evidence to address this issue. Firstly, if the results were indeed spurious, we should not then expect any heterogeneous upgrading by the respondents based on their personal experiences. We should expect to see households upgrading their expectations independently of their shopping experience. However, we find that households who shop frequently focus more on higher quality goods in their formation of inflation expectations. And this is not consistent with spurious effects. Moreover, should the results be spurious, we should expect to see the spurious effects to be lesser for the respondents who are financially literate in inflation. As these households have shown to be more consistent and accurate in terms of inflation expectations in our survey, they should be less prone to spurious learning. Nonetheless, we find that treatment effects of this subgroup of financial literacy are positive, significant, and similar in magnitude as well to those of our main table. Again, these results are not consistent with spurious learning. So, it's about time. Okay, in conclusion, what do we find? In conclusion, our findings do highlight the relationship between personal experience, product variety, and inflation expectations. So we're going to complement the literature, okay, on all the hard work we discussed earlier at the start of the day, okay, in terms of the different drivers of expectations. And we want to show one very simple thing, but important impact, that quality matters. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much. Any questions? Are there any questions that we have so far? Okay.
Yeah, I'll jump in and ask one real quick. So a quick question about your treatment groups. Why was Häagen-Dazs's price in 2009 not included in all the treatment groups? So I'm thinking like treatment 2, people are just calculating the inflation rate between the cheap Wells brand, I believe, and then the expensive Haagen-Dazs one. I was just wondering what was the decision-making process there?
Okay, that's the question, Rupal. It's a great question. So our objective is to find out how households respond to different types of goods. So we do not want them to know prices of goods in 2009. So basically this, because if we know prices of the same type of goods, they could so-called contaminate our upgrading channel. So we're going to see the households response and upgrade from Walls to Haagen-Dazs and not Haagen-Dazs to Haagen-Dazs.
Understood.
But of course, if we have more power, we can actually do work on it as well. We have more power like what they have in previous papers.
Thank
to
you.
find out what happens. It's very interesting as well. Thanks, Rupal. Any more?
Okay, any further questions to anyone? Well, we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to conclude. I want to first thank Michael and Sumit for putting together such a wonderful session. I want to thank Rupal, Ricardo, Dimitris, and Chua for very clear presentation. All these papers are very interesting. To me, a good session is one that I will leave with a lot of questions in my head. So I'm thinking about like why would our belief be so polarized and it affect our expectations so much? I'm wondering why that the heightened inflation does not affect our wage expectation in recent years. And I'm just curious, like, why would people who actually pay mortgage and not knowing their mortgage rate, why are households so inattentive and underinformed? And then the last paper we just listened to is really intriguing about why people are not adjusting for the quality of the upgrade of the consumption, informing their expectations. To me, this is a very meaningful session because policymakers, the monetary authorities have a lot of questions and they can learn from this session on things that they need to pay attention to in order to have meaningful communication of the monetary policies and the directions and provide us with the right guidance so that we can form the right expectations and behave optimally. So one more time, thank you everybody. It's a wonderful session. Thanks to the speakers and organizers. And for those who are in Singapore, or in Asia, it's time to dinner. For those who are in US, I hope you can catch a nap again. And for those in Europe, have a good day ahead. Thank you.